Hey, hello class. Welcome back for Tuesday's lecture. This is April 28th or something like that. Lord only even knows. This is the first of two lectures for tonight. This first one's a longer one. The second one will be a little bit shorter. We're continuing to stick around in the 1830s and 40s. We will eventually move past that time period. But I'm going to start out by talking about a gentleman who came from overseas and visited the United States and had some interesting observations. So the French government in the early 1830s hired a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville and asked him to go over to the United States to investigate how the United States was doing prisons, because there's some interest in prison reform in France at the time, and they're wondering how the United States, as a differently run country, was doing that. So this gentleman named Alexis de Tocqueville traveled around the United States and got the information that he needed, but he was here for a long enough time that he got a lot of flavor of what the country was like. And so after he went back to France, in addition to writing up this report for the French government on how Americans ran prisons differently than France, later he compiled his notes from his voyages and explorations over here um, into a book that came out in two volumes, first one in 1835, the second one in 1840, and they're called Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was fascinated by the way American culture was different from everything that he knew in France and all over Europe. He's a well-traveled man. And so he was convinced that there was something inherently different about the American experience, and he was convinced that the root of that was democracy and the democratic principles that the country was living by. Today, still, when people are trying to understand what made America different and what made America tick in the Jacksonian era, this is really one of the primary sources that people go to, because in chapter after chapter, de Tocqueville laid out a bunch of very interesting observations that he made about what American civilization, culture, and what the people were like. In one of his chapters, de Tocqueville had a discussion of American religion. Religious sentiment, Christianity, was on the decline in Europe and in France, where he was coming from, and that is still true today, where the Europeans are generally relatively less religious than the United States is. But what he saw in America when he came here in the 1830s was, as he reported in his chapter, was an incredible amount of religious fervor. As it turns out, he was here during one of the biggest waves of religious sentiment. He is here during a huge wave of expansion of religion. And so around the time that he's here, approximately three-quarters of all Americans are really engaged in their faith. So many other observations that he made, but sticking with that one gives us a window into some big changes that were going on in American culture in the 1830s or so. This is the Second Great Awakening. And so you'll remember that there had been a First Great Awakening, and that had happened about a century earlier. 1730s and 40s was roughly the date for that. It started in England and came over here to the colonies. And there were a bunch of religious leaders who encouraged people to become more religious again. George Whitefield was one of them, a guy I didn't mention at the time named Jonathan Edwards, who was from here, led a lot of people back into the church and in some cases into religious sentiment for the first time. I didn't really talk a lot about the First Great Awakening in the 1700s because I'm not always sure how to connect it up to things that are going on at that time during my Colonies Mature lecture, but I do need to mention it because, of course, there's going to be a later one. It doesn't make sense to talk about a Second Great Awakening unless you talk about a First Great Awakening. So let's get some ideas of what was going on in that First Great Awakening before we pick up the later one. The First Great Awakening was in many ways a revival of some of the religious ideas of the Puritans, and therefore it emphasized sin, it emphasized punishment. The relationship with God that they're talking about in the First Great Awakening was something that I think a lot of people who may be religious today would find a little bit more scary. So, in one of the most famous sermons in the American part of the First Great Awakening, was a sermon given by Jonathan Edwards, this famous minister from Massachusetts. And the title of the sermon gives away a lot of the themes of that. It was called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And so the idea there is that people are sinners, that people, ever since Adam and Eve, have had sin and have really deserved punishment. and the only people that God ever lets into heaven are the ones he kind of feels sorry for. And that really worked. That was the theme of the First Great Awakening. It didn't necessarily inspire people as much as scare them, but it was very successful, and there was at the time, a huge expansion of religious sentiment, although it did sort of fade away in the decades that followed, and then the American Revolution happened and they got distracted. But there's a second Great Awakening, a second big wave of revivals within the various Protestant churches that started small in the first decade of the 1800s and really picked up in a big way in the 1820s and 30s. And as I said, by the time de Tocqueville came in the early 1830s, he's arriving just as the Second Great Awakening had crested. And although they don't have public opinion polls in those days, our best guess is that maybe three-quarters of all Americans at the peak of the Second Great Awakening were in some way affiliated with a church or had some sort of strong religious connection to a higher power, belief in God, or something like that. So that Second Great Awakening was in many ways actually bigger, and as we'll see, is going to be more consequential than the first one. So first of all, we need to sort of understand where the Second Great Awakening came from, and then we'll talk about its results. Uh, as was similar to the case with the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening was inspired by traveling ministers who went around the country trying to preach the gospel and trying to encourage converts to either come back to the church, whichever church. They weren't necessarily affiliated with any particular Protestant brand of Christianity, or in some cases, come to church for the first time and find religious sentiment as something in their lives. Um, there are a bunch of very well-known ministers who were very successful during the Second Great Awakening, but the one I'm going to focus on is probably one of the most famous of the time, a minister named Charles Grandison Finney. Finney was born in Connecticut in the late 1700s and then spent some time in New York and New Jersey. At various times in his adulthood, he was trained as a lawyer, and then he was a school teacher, both professions where it is important to be able to communicate effectively with the people who you're responsible for. Later, when he got the call to the ministry and felt this religious sentiment, one of his great successes was going to be that early training where he really was able, when he gave his sermons, his listeners really understood the precepts that he was laying down because he knew how to take very complicated ideas and boil them down into phrases and principles that were easily understood. And that was part of his success. Finney was so successful that eventually ministers all over, especially the North, were begging him to come to their community to lead these religious revivals, revival meetings that would go on for days at a time. Ministers in a bunch of different Protestant communities, some Presbyterian, some Methodist, some Baptist. Finney didn't have a particular denomination that he focused on. They would be desperate to have him come because he would come for multiple days and he'd preach to hundreds, eventually thousands of people who came from miles around to listen to what the man said. One of the most famous guys in the country at the time, one of the most inspiring people in the country at the time. Finney was successful not just because he laid things out clearly, but also because he believed that religion should be inspirational, as opposed to the First Great Awakening, where the religious leaders thought that religion should sort of be scary or scolding. Finney and the other leaders of the Second Great Awakening really emphasized sort of a positive sense about what religion should be, and tried to make sure that they inspired their listeners, who then they hoped would join the church or at least stick with the church after they left. So Finney was very successful, and the Second Great Awakening that he helped inspire was very successful, particularly in the North. Many of the places where Finney traveled were in the North. Many of the other Second Great Awakening ministers had their early successes and at the peak of it in the North. And therefore, the Second Great Awakening itself is going to have a bigger effect in the North, although it did impact the South as well. So, digging into Finney's ideas a little bit more will give you some idea about why he was so successful. Because Finney had a different perspective on religion and on the relationship with God than was the case with the ministers of the First Great Awakening, most of whom were building on that idea of sin and sinfulness, that we talked about in the context of the Puritans, which was really all about punishment and really all about sort of undeserving people who had no chance or no choice in their fate. Finney had a very different point of view. As he traveled around to these various congregations and he spoke before hundreds or thousands of people in these outdoor camp meetings, um, Finney summed up his idea in a sentence that was one of the most well-known religious ideas of his time. Charles Grandison Finney told his listeners, "God has made man a moral free agent." Now, we'll put aside the sexism there. It's not going to be probably till like the 1970s or so that you will start to hear people not use such blatantly sexist language in public discussion. That's a long-term project. It's going to require, among other things, the women's movement to get moving, which is, by the way, the beginning of it is the subject of our second lecture for today. So when he says man, he really means humanity. Okay. But putting that aside for the moment, let's talk about what he means. So if you follow sports, the phrase free agent should ring a bell because the idea there in sports is that somebody it has a contract to play for a team, and then that contract is up. At which point that person becomes a free agent, which means that they can bid out their services to whichever team they are willing to then play for. So they're looking for maybe the best financial deal, or maybe the best long term deal, or maybe a place where they think they have the best chance to win. Well, Finney had a similar idea, except that Finney is thinking about the soul, and he's really thinking that there's just two teams. And those teams are God's team, the team of heaven, the team of godliness, the team of purity, and that team is a team that people can choose to join if they wish to, or my cat is attacking my computer right now, so that's pretty good. Apparently, doesn't like Charles Grandison Finney. We'll hope that that doesn't keep shaking the computer there. Or the other team is the Devil's team, which my cat apparently has joined. Um, the Devil's team, the team of sin, the team that's going to lead you to hell. Um, the, but the key thing here is that Finney believed that people could choose. And this is different from what the Puritans believed. This is different from the ideas of the First Great Awakening. Finney believed that everybody had a choice and that you're a free agent, which means that you can make that decision. You can pick which side you're going to go for. You can choose to try to be a good person and then be rewarded with that. Or you can choose to follow the path of sin, but that's your choice. It's not God telling you that. It's not God deciding it. It's not some all powerful God sort of determining things way before we even exist. This is people have some say in the fate of their soul by the decisions that they make on a day to day basis. So that's a powerful, powerful idea because it implies choice, it implies agency, and also Finney believed that you could change. And this is a crucial part of his message. So if you were a sinner, if you had in some way led a life that up to the time that you hear his message or some other religious message, if you'd been a bad person and you should be punished, well, you could change. You could be inspired to change your fate, to change the direction of your life by deciding, I'm not going to go down the path of sin. I'm going to instead, from this point on, try to follow the path of righteousness, to follow the path that I hope God will reward me and take me to heaven. And if people did change, then God would reward them because God would understand that they had made a difference in their lives and tried to become better people. So Finney is offering a very optimistic sense about a human person's relationship with their higher power and also with their own fate. In that way, I think that Finney's ideas are very, very American because a lot of the basic principle of Americanism is about being able to change, is about being able to start over, is about new opportunities. And although that normally is thought of as sort of being able to move somewhere else or start a new job or whatever, still that principle, that basic principle of being able to try something new and being able to turn over a new leaf and start again as a new person, That strikes me as very, very deeply connected to some of the ideals of America that go back to the colonial days. So he's touching on something that a lot of his listeners, it would resonate with them because they would recognize something very similar to the way their lives are living. Now, Finney and the other Second Great Awakening ministers, they're also successful because they are preaching at a time of great uncertainty, and people are looking for something that they can rely on. You'll remember that around the same time, particularly in the North, which is where the Second Great Awakening had its greatest effects, you'll remember that at this same time, the economic changes are going on that I talked about in my previous lecture, 2 lectures ago. Um, and those are things like the transportation revolution, the market revolution, and all the changes in the workplace that we summarized in talking about the bastardization of craft. So, what that means is that people who had traditionally lived a certain way, suddenly the world is changing around them. And that led to much uncertainty. All the things that I described in the way local communities began to change when the transportation revolution came in and the market revolution became part of their lives. To live through that time of change would be very disorienting and for some people very concerning. And therefore, people are going to be looking in a time of uncertainty for some kind of bedrock, for something that they can trust, for some way that they can live that will either help them understand where they are in the world or give them some kind of moral values that they think they can stick with, no matter how confusing or how changeable the world around them is. And of course, some of the principles of the market revolution also led people to look for some sort of moral standing in the universe, because not only are they uncertain sort of where they stand in these economic changes, but the market revolution is really all about competition. The market revolution is all about a dog eat dog, us against the world economic status that led many people down paths that, at the end of the day, they weren't always very comfortable with. If you're going to succeed in this new market economy, if you're an employer, you have to change your relationship with your employees. You're going to have to pay them less. You're going to have to see them as sort of interchangeable parts and not as real people. And people who are going out looking for work, not only are they uncertain about whether or not they're going to find the jobs that they need, but they know that they're competing against other people for that work. And therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of uncertainty about right and wrong in a time that seems to sort of have become sort of amoral or at least untethered from the old traditional ways of living. And in that context, it's not that surprising then that people turned in large numbers to religion, especially given the inspirational message that Finney and some of the other Second Great Awakening leaders are spreading through the country. And definitely it's not surprising that the places where the Second Great Awakening was strongest in this period were the same places where economically these changes were happening and were causing a lot of turmoil as people were trying to adjust to them. So, New England, upstate New York, right where the Erie Canal is, and is blazing a path and changing really the entire upper Midwest and New York City, all of those places are places where the Second Great Awakening had a tremendous, tremendous effect. And so you put all that together, and so the Second Great Awakening had this overwhelming impact on American Christianity, as people who lived through that time were inspired by these ideals and fearful of their place in the world, and therefore returned to religion. Christianity and the Protestant faiths of Christianity in the United States grew rapidly in this period. Now, Finney's message and the overall message of the Second Great Awakening, which was all about the possibility of change, the possibility of doing better, the possibility of improving oneself and one's prospects, that also had a ripple effect throughout society. Because people who were inspired by the Second Great Awakening were supposed to not just focus on themselves and their own soul, but instead, people in the Second Great Awakening were supposed to then spread this message of faith and hope and change, the idea of reform, the principles of reforming one's soul and making oneself better, that's something that the Second Great Awakening encouraged everyone who was involved in the Second Great Awakening churches to then spread that message to their neighbors and their family members and other people that they met. There's a real strong sense of evangelism that's a crucial part of the Second Great Awakening. And that meant that in the long run, the Second Great Awakening will be a bigger deal than the First Great Awakening because coming out of it, there is this sense of reform. It's religious based, but it has impacts all over the culture and all over the society because people who are getting this message that they themselves should reform and then they should help reform the people around them, they also burst out of the churches and began to try to work to reform the culture at large. And as a result, the Second Great Awakening inspired a tremendous amount of religious fervor, but also cultural and social reform fervor, with the result that there is really no time in American history quite like this. We like to think of the 1960s as a time of turmoil and a time when people are all out to change the country. And yes, that's a time of the anti-Vietnam demonstrations and the civil rights movement at its peak, and various other things that are going on. But in the end, that was a drop in the bucket in terms of participation compared to the huge numbers of Americans who were involved in many, many different aspects of trying to reform American society in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s as they're inspired by the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening is going to have, even after it began to fade away, is going to have these long-term effects as it inspires a lot of significant reform movements, ultimately helping spark the most consequential reform movement possibly in American history, which we'll get to at the end of the lecture. So let's work our way through some of the specific reform movements that came out of the Second Great Awakening to get a sense of the breadth of what Second Great Awakening Christians were trying to do in their culture and their society. It's not surprising that the first of these significant reform movements comes directly out of the Bible, because, of course, these are people who are inspired by their Christianity, by their religious sense. Um, if you know the Bible and you go back to the Old Testament and to the days of Moses and the Ten Commandments, one of the Ten Commandments, right there at the top, is the commandment that comes down that says that the Sabbath day, the Lord's day, should be kept holy. And the Sabbath day, which most Christians celebrate on Sunday, there's a handful of Christian denominations that celebrate that on Saturday, but we'll focus on Sunday. The Sabbath day, according to this basic principle of Christianity that goes back to the basic principle of Judaism, out of which Christianity grew, that basic principle is that, in theory, the Lord's Day, the day of prayer, is a day just for prayer. It's a day for going to church, being inspired by one's relationship with God, and then spending time praying or inside the home, hang out with family, maybe a nice sunny dinner. But the Sabbatarian movement, which was a movement intended to try to make sure that the Sabbath day was kept holy, these people were very disturbed by the fact that the Sabbath day was really not a holy day in American society in the early 1800s. They were concerned about all the business and commerce that was going on routinely on Sunday. They were concerned about the cultural activities that people routinely engaged in on Sunday. One of their big concerns was the fact that bars and saloons were open on Sunday, which seemed very much against the spirit of a holy day, a day where one is supposed to be praying and in church. That seemed very much not the intention of a Sabbath day, although many people go out to the saloons on Sunday because it's the only day they have off from work. A lot of the Sabbatarians, this religious reform movement that grew out of the Second Great Awakening, were also disturbed at the way the government engaged in governmental activities, and they began to try to get laws passed to have the government not engage in its activities, and then also try to get laws passed to limit or shut down a lot of commercial activities that they believe took away from this holy intention for Sunday to be a day of rest and a day of spiritual reflection. So, if you've ever wondered why you don't get the mail on Sunday, why the mail comes 6 days a week but not on Sunday. That dates back to the Sabbatarians in the 1820s and 30s. They were lobbying the federal government in a big way for there not to be any kind of handling of the mail on Sundays, which to them seems sacrilegious. Of course, Amazon does have a contract with the Postal Service, and so now you may see mail trucks on Sundays, but that's a recent exception. Otherwise, the mail simply doesn't arrive on Sundays because postal workers don't work that day, again, with that recent exception. And that is one of the lasting effects of the Sabbatarian movement, showing that they had effects all the way up to the federal government level. And remember, I said previously, the Postal Service is pretty much the only part of the government that people actually see on a regular basis until the 20th century. And therefore, that's a very specific place for them to go looking for this kind of change. At the local level, so at the town or city or county level, Sabbatarian groups had significant impacts on commercial activities. There are lots of places, and there's still places, where bars are not open on Sunday because of the Sabbatarian movement and the principles behind it. I went to college in Connecticut, and there's lots of limitations on what you can buy. The liquor stores are not open on Sunday for reasons that date back to the Sabbatarian movement in the 1800s. And it's not as common anymore, but there are still places where businesses are not open on Sunday. I grew up in New Jersey, which is not a particularly conservative place and not a remarkably religious place um, by the standards of the country today. And yet, when I was young in the 1980s, the mall was not open on Sunday. The local mall, which is a pretty big mall, was not open on Sunday because the local regulations didn't allow it. And that's a Sabbatarian idea that dates back over a century before that. Now the mall's open on Sunday all over New Jersey, but that was a much more recent change. A lot of people who were inspired by the religious groups of the Sabbatarians believed that it was just not a good idea, that it was not religiously okay for these kind of commercial activities to exist on Sundays. And there are still examples of this, of course. The Chick-fil-A company, they're not open on Sunday. They've chosen to give up a day's worth of revenue because of the religious sentiments of the leaders of the company. And there are places in the country where um, bars and saloons are still closed down on Sunday, or there are still limitations on what sort of commercial activities people are allowed to engage in. The Sabbatarians still have that effect. And yet they mostly faded away as a strong and large interest group by around the mid to late 1840s because they felt that they had failed to really make the kind of overall cultural change in the country that they are out for. To me, I think that they are setting the bar way too high. Any organization that has that effect on the government and is able at the local level to get all kinds of laws and policies enacted, to me, that is quite a successful organization. That's quite a successful pressure group. But they were honestly expecting that they would be able to get the whole country to shut down on Sunday. And when they couldn't get that done, then a lot of the Sabbatarians kind of moved away from the movement. To me, I think that that's just asking too much because they were actually much more successful than they gave themselves credit for. Now, there's another important reform movement of the time that's not as obviously religious, although there is a religious connection, and that's the health reformers of the day. Medicine at this time is barely even a science. They're not using leeches anymore, but they're not that far away from that. And a lot of the basic scientific knowledge that doctors have today, including how disease spreads or anything about germ theory, all of that is decades away. And so, medical science at the time, although the profession is considered to be an elite profession, the reality is that they didn't really know very much. And there are a lot of people who were concerned about the public health in general in the early 1800s, particularly because there were regular waves of epidemic diseases, not quite like the one that we've been experiencing this year, but still significant waves of epidemic diseases would spread through parts of the country and carry off many people because they were just deadly. So cholera and yellow fever and a bunch of other diseases would sometimes spread through, especially urban places where folks live close together and their living conditions may not be good, and so may be more susceptible to spreading it to each other. Those sorts of things were common enough and scary enough that there were people in the country who wanted to do something about it, people outside directly of medicine. And this is a periodic thing that you see throughout the 19th century until really doctors began to better understand what could be done, and medical science really took over in response to these big public health issues. But in the 19th century, and particularly in the time of the Second Great Awakening, there were health reformers who began to spread their ideas and found a lot of interest among the Second Great Awakening Christians. And it appears that the success of some of these health reformers at the time is connected to the Second Great Awakening because people are thinking if they can stay physically healthy, then they will also be able to keep their souls and their mind and their attitude more healthy. The idea is basically a healthy body gives you a healthy soul, or something like that. The most important of the health reformers of this period is a guy named Sylvester Graham. Graham uh, was very concerned about the spread of these diseases, and decided that he was going to offer some ideas for how to solve them. He gave a series of lectures that then were put together and published in a book in the late 1820s, and ultimately made him one of the most famous Americans of his era, to the point where there were clubs that then tried to spread his ideas all throughout the country, the Graham clubs that got together and they talked about his lectures and they talked about his ideas and tried to spread his principles. Many of the people who joined those clubs were also in the Second Great Awakening churches, inspired by the changes that they were hoping to make in their society and to make themselves more healthy as a result. Graham, in his lectures and in the books and in his prescriptions for society, Graham offered a bunch of criticisms of the way people lived, and then some suggestions for ways that people could live that would be more healthy and make them better able to fight off the diseases that otherwise they seemed very susceptible to. So Graham focused on the American diet. He was convinced that the American diet was making people unhealthy because it was running them down in various ways. So he was concerned about American meat consumption, especially red meat. He believed that Americans drank too much, and he thought that spicy foods or anything that had too much flavor in it, all of those things he thought were working against the health of the body because they're sort of forcing the body to work extra, and therefore the body would be tired out, and if exposed to disease, then more likely to catch the disease. So he's proposing instead, and he is considered by some to be the father of American vegetarianism. He is proposing instead a diet that would eliminate those things and instead be a much simpler diet that would be focused on fruits and vegetables and whole grains, and then drinking water as opposed to drinking alcoholic beverages. And we'll hear more about alcohol a little bit later in this lecture. And although there will be people who would object today to some of the limitations of the diet, and anybody who is trying to stay gluten-free or anything like that wouldn't want the high emphasis on the whole grains. Nevertheless, it wouldn't be hard to find people who are going to offer some similar dietetic suggestions to Americans today, and certainly eating a lot of red meat and drinking a lot of booze, and eating a lot of spicy foods and things like that could be dangerous to your constitution. So, and of course, fruits and vegetables are good for you. So he's on target there. Graham also suggested that Americans bathe more often. In those days, it's not unusual for people not to bathe more than once a week, and in some cases, maybe not even once a month. Graham was convinced that frequent bathing would wash away, he wasn't really sure what's causing disease, but he felt that that would make people more healthy. And it is true that if you don't bathe that often, you are going to be more susceptible to disease because you're just not washing off the things you've been exposed to. Graham also thought that living conditions were something that they should focus on. So he proposed that Americans would be better able to fight off disease if they were living in homes that had better ventilation, as opposed to being crowded together, especially in the big cities where diseases seem to spread a lot. And both of those things, frequent bathing, better ventilated homes, it'd be very difficult to find anybody who would object to any of those things on a public health basis. So he was on target. And the people who joined the Graham clubs, they tried to then make sure that the culture around them was going to pick up on these ideas. And so up to this point, you may say, okay, Sylvester Graham sounds like, he sounds like a pretty smart guy. Graham also had one other area that he focused on that I'm guessing most Americans today might have a small objection to. Not sure. Don't want to point any fingers. But one other activity that Graham thought was dangerous to one's health was the act of sex. As far as Graham was concerned, after the sex act, one is physically depleted, is sweating and panting and tired. And he was convinced that that meant that to do the act of sex was to run the risk of wearing one's body out and then not be able to fight off whatever it is that caused disease. And so in his lectures, Graham prescribed that sex, which should only happen between married couples, of course, as far as he was concerned, sex really should be something that was only for the purposes of procreation. And so therefore, once a month was enough. That would be enough to make sure that children happen at least from time to time. And anything beyond that he thought was physically dangerous and was running a risk of people getting sick. Again, I don't want to assume too much, but based on what I understand about the way American culture works today, I would imagine that many Americans today would say, well, Mr. Graham, we're going to have to part company with you there. But as I said, his ideas are very, very successful, and especially young people join these Graham clubs and try to spread his ideas. Graham himself tried to help spread his ideas not only by delivering the lecture over and over again to listeners all over the country, but also by trying to help spread some of his ideas about diet. He is, of course, asking for some significant changes in the way people consume and what and how they consume. And there were lots of objections that said, well, what you're proposing, nobody's going to do that because that's such a bland diet and no one's going to want to eat that stuff. And so to prove that it actually could work, Graham developed a biscuit that would be a little more flavorful than the sort of traditional biscuits that were available, and then began to market that with his name, which is, of course, the origins of the graham cracker, which still exists and is still named after him, even though most people have long forgotten who the Graham was in the graham cracker. And he was successful and made some money on this. Little did he know in the 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st century, that the graham cracker doesn't taste very much like the original graham cracker that he came up with, because companies that market it to people have added extra flavoring to make it a little bit less boring, whether it's cinnamon on top of it or honey. And certainly he had no idea that Girl Scouts in the 20th century would use it as one of the main ingredients in s'mores, which was not at all what he was thinking. But still, Graham has had tremendous success in helping spread this reform movement that was aimed at the body, that was aimed at health. And many of the Second Great Awakening inspired people join these Graham clubs because they're trying to connect body and soul. Well, Graham had picked up on one particular concern that the Second Great Awakening especially focused on, which was drinking. As I said, Graham thought that Americans drank too much, and he's encouraging drinking just water as a healthy alternative. And there was a theme, a very strong theme, in the reform movements of the Second Great Awakening that talked about drinking and emphasized that too much drinking was bad for people. This is sort of an old theme. It had been around in Protestant churches for a few centuries at this point. Ministers routinely would talk to their congregations from time to time about the perils of drunkenness, because the idea is that if one is drunk, one is less likely to be able to resist the temptation of other sins. And so ministers routinely would be concerned about this at the time of the Revolution and during the colonial days. And the Puritan ministers talked about this. And back in England and other parts of the world, Protestant ministers would talk about the sin of drunkenness and their concerns about Americans drinking too much all the time. But as it turns out, in the time of the Second Great Awakening, an attack on drinking too much really took off and came out of the Second Great Awakening churches because it turns out that it's time for someone to do something about the fact that Americans are drinking really a lot. Historians of drinking refer to this time as the time when where the United States was a nation of drinkers. And there's been some studies that have been done that indicate that the average American in the 1820s is drinking about twice as much as the average American of today, which, without assuming too much about you guys on the other side of the computer screen there, um, I'm going to assume that most of you are too young to be able to drink legally, which means, of course, you've never had any alcoholic beverages because you would never break the law. But you know people who have had alcoholic beverages and you know the way the world works. And you can do some quick math here and imagine twice as much booze being consumed in this country today as it is now, and probably your mind is a little bit boggled. And it's actually even more extreme than that, because the United States in those days was a much younger country and it skewed much younger. So if we exclude the children and then focus on the adults, that means that actually there's more drinking, even more than twice as much. And then if you also focus on what they're drinking, because in the 19th century they're not drinking light beer, they're not drinking wine coolers, they're not drinking anything out to give you sort of a mild buzz. No, nothing like that. The kinds of things that Americans are drinking when they drink has a much higher alcohol content than the typical things that are available to most people today. And so if you focus just on the adults of the country, and if you look at the alcohol content of what they're drinking, the typical American adult is consuming 4 or maybe even 5 times as much alcohol per person as the typical American adult of today. And that's an astonishing figure. It makes you wonder how they can get out of bed in the morning. It makes you wonder how they can just even survive. Um, that's an incredible amount of alcoholic consumption. And so, as a movement is arising against all the drinking, they're responding to what today we might consider a public health crisis. This is a country that seems to have a problem. Well, before we get to the movement, it's worth just talking about why is it that there's so much drinking going on in this country in the 1800s? And there's a bunch of reasons for that. There are cultural predispositions to drinking. Drinking had been a part of the culture that the English colonists had brought over with them. Social drinking, family drinking, individual drinking was a part of the culture. I mentioned previously the Puritans had no problem with drinking. They just don't like people to get drunk all the time. And that's something that they have in common with all the other English colonists who brought over with them the idea of alcohol as sort of part of their culture. And so there's nothing in what they've been brought up on to make them believe that this is a bad thing. And then there's the fact that there aren't a lot of other alternatives for things to do. This is not a time when people who are looking for some sort of social outlet have all kinds of alternatives. So if you want to hang out with your friends, then the place to go is the local bar. And so that's a big part of just everyday, day-to-day life. And then, of course, there's the fact that you got to drink something, but most alternatives that one might consider today as something that one might drink if one is trying not to drink booze, a lot of those either they don't exist or they're not healthy alternatives. So, water, of course, and that's what Graham was suggesting people drink. Water is a healthy alternative, except that today we can generally rely on our water to be safe, unless you unfortunately live in a place like Flint, Michigan, where the water is still not safe, and that's baffling. A terrible public health crisis there. But the water that was available to most Americans in the 19th century is not going to be particularly healthy, and in fact could be dangerous to your health unless you're lucky enough to have a well where you can pump water directly from underneath the ground in your community. Otherwise, most of the water that's available is going to come from rivers that frankly are incredibly polluted by the early 1800s. And that's because rivers, running water, which is frequently where cities and towns are built for transportation purposes, but also communities are built along the river because that's an easy way to dispose of waste. And by waste, I mean everything. So anything that people in the town want to get rid of, if they're along a river, in those days they're just going to throw it into the water. And that includes human waste. In most towns and cities, people put out their chamber pots along outside their house, and then there's someone who works for the town or the city who come by in the middle of the night and empty those chamber pots and put them in a wagon. They're the night soil men, is what they're called. And then they bring those wagons over to the docks, and then they dump the wagons into the river, which means that the water itself is incredibly polluted. The theory of the time was that running water purifies itself. And given enough time, that would be true, but a river is not really going to be big enough or long enough, especially once there's a lot of people living along the river, to be able to completely purify itself no matter how hard it's trying, particularly the farther you get down the river. So, a river, for example, like the Hudson River, most important river in New York State. People who live at the top of that river, so at Albany, up at the near the very top of the state, they might be able to trust the water that they dip out of the Hudson River because there's almost nobody else before them has thrown anything in. But farther down, more and more towns, more and more people have thrown stuff into the river. And by the time that gets to New York City, the biggest city in the state, and eventually it's going to be the biggest city in the country, by the time it gets down there, there's so much pollution in it, including human waste, that it would be foolish to drink that water. It was clearly dangerous, bad for your health. Um, and you can just see it by looking at it. Other parts of the country where there are rivers that may not be as dangerous because there's not as much pollution, because they're in parts of the country where there aren't as many people to pollute the water, still the water doesn't look good or taste good or seem healthy. If you live near the Mississippi River, which in the early 1800s is not a place where there's a lot of people yet, not a lot of white people yet, anyway, a lot of Native Americans around there. Um, but you're not likely to want to drink water from the Mississippi River. It's referred to as the Big Muddy, and there's a reason for that. The water looks like it just filled with silt, and so if you dip a cup into that, you're going to have to let the mud and the silt settle to the bottom before you can even consider drinking it, and that's pretty gross. So water is really not a good, safe option for most people. They had learned their lesson that drinking some of that water is just going to make them sick. Other alternatives that do exist in theory were limited because of some of the limitations on the technology of the time. So milk, for example. Milk is something that you might have some in your fridge right now, and you can still get it at the stores. Last I checked, um, but milk is not something that is going to be readily available outside of right where there's a cow because they have no refrigeration. And without refrigeration, for most parts of the year, the milk is quickly going to turn sour, and then not long after it turns sour, it's just going to turn. And if you drink milk that has gone bad, you are going to get very sick. Also in the 19th century, so they don't have refrigeration, they hadn't developed pasteurization, which is a method that was developed a few decades later, 1860s and 1870s. That is a method that is used to take some of the things that are in the milk that may make people sick that are going to come from the cow. That process doesn't get developed until later, and therefore drinking cow's milk or goat's milk or sheep's milk or whatever, you're going to catch the same diseases that the animal that gave the milk is going to has itself. And so milk is not something that people drink very commonly. It's associated with mother's milk, and so small children drink it. But other than that, most people stay away from it because it's just considered to be unhealthy. There are some other alternatives that exist, but a lot of the things that we think of today are just not really likely options. You can drink tea, for example, but most Americans stay as far away from tea as possible in the early 1800s. It's expensive, but also their concern is it's associated in a bad way, in a negative way, with the British. After all, the Boston Tea Party, those American patriots destroyed tea. And so, although there might be Americans who want to drink tea, they can't get their hands on it because of the expense, and most people stay away from it because it's considered to be not something that Americans drink. Coffee, of course, is an alternative and is sort of a more American form of caffeination. But coffee is much more expensive than it is today. It's really not until later in the 19th century that there's regular supplies of coffee at a price that most people can afford. And so that's just simply not an option. Most of the other kinds of drinks that one might find in a refrigerator these days are not available to Americans in the early 1800s. Refrigeration is not available, carbonation is not available, so sodas or other things like that, those come much later in the 1800s. And instead, the drinks that are available are drinks that are socially acceptable and are really a key part of American culture. So the rum trade, which has been around since the colonial days, and in fact was one of the main things that led to the American Revolution, since it was one of the things that was the underpinnings of the Sugar Act in 1764. The rum trade is still an important part of American culture and American economics in the early 1800s. In 1810, the rum distilleries and the rum manufacturing is the third largest business in the country, although it's on the decline. And around the same time that rum begins to decline, whiskey and whiskey distilling became a more important part of American culture, partly brought by immigrants from places like Ireland, and also just because as there's more corn that's being grown in the country, whiskey distilling from corn is a valuable way to sort of store the corn and get some extra product out of it. So those are all things that are happening, and people accept them as just a regular part of their lives. Um, or if you're wealthy, uh, one of the most important ways that wealthy people show off their wealth, and this is somewhat true still today for some people, is their wine cellars. So, someone like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, they are going to display their wealth uh, by the wine that they serve at dinner or after dinner or whatever. And that's a big part of the culture, at least of elites. And then there's children. I threw off the children a little while ago when I was focusing on the adults and how much drinking adults do. But kids drank too, it turns out. Today, kids are constantly complaining, oh, there's nothing to drink. And kids do that back in the day as well. The solution that most families offered to their children was they would give them juice or cider, especially in rural areas, although it was also available in urban areas. But again, there's no refrigeration, which means that any juice or cider that is made from anything that you can make juice out of, that's going to ferment. And so, unless it's drunk right away, after a day or two or a week or whatever, the juice that's left over from the initial first few swigs, that juice has a kick to it. In fact, one of the reasons that Americans are able to consume so much alcohol as adults is that children are drinking alcoholic beverages too and beginning to develop a tolerance at a very young age without really giving so much thought to it. But hard cider and other things like that are a part of American culture. Everybody's drinking. That's the point here. This is truly a nation of drinkers. But there's so much alcoholic consumption that clearly this is a problem. And as the movement against drinking begins to take off, coming out of the Second Great Awakening, they are beginning to address what, in hindsight, is truly a public health crisis. Now, the movement against drinking in these Second Great Awakening churches did not define itself, excuse me, as trying to get rid of drinking, because it was clearly so much a part of the culture. Instead, what they tried to do was have Americans in general and the country as a whole drink less. Another word for doing less of something is to temper it. And so the movement against drinking that came out of the Second Great Awakening churches in the 1830s and 40s was called the temperance movement. And their goal is to get individuals to drink less, to get some individuals to stop drinking entirely, and to have the overall consumption of alcohol in the country decline. But they're trying to do this by persuasion. And so they start in the churches. Temperance reformers began to speak in churches, speak before congregations as the Second Great Awakening is hitting its peak, and emphasize that drunkenness would not allow one to stay out of sin. And what they tried to do after they riled up the congregation and got everybody excited about the idea, is they would then encourage the parishioners to come forward and sign a public pledge before all their neighbors and their fellow parishioners to say that they are not going to drink anymore. And the temperance reform leaders, they don't really expect everyone who signs the pledge to completely cut drinking out of their lives. What they were hoping was the social pressure of having signed this pledge in the emotional fervor of the moment would make them less likely to drink. And some of them would drink less, and some of them might not drink at all because they'd be embarrassed to backslide in front of their neighbors who had seen them sign the pledge. And so, in churches all throughout the country, especially where the Second Great Awakening was very strong, this temperance movement began, and it began to spread because there is this real sense that reform is possible and reform is necessary, and this is an area that people need to reform. The temperance movement grew very rapidly and had a lot of success. One of their successes came in an area that may surprise you. Uh, as the temperance movement took off in New England, some wealthy people who had signed this pledge and promised not to drink decided that they should then do something about their employees. Because in traditional workplaces, dating back before the revolution and earlier, traditionally, when you go to work for someone, that person provides you with a wage and that person provides you with training, but that person also provides you with booze. The traditional workplace at the time of the revolution and all through the colonial days and the very beginning of the 1800s, if you had a if you sort of dropped yourself into them, you would see a bunch of people sitting around and working on whatever they're working on, and in the corner would be a keg or a few bottles of wine or some whiskey or something like that, and that was expected as part of the way work took place. Um, People go to work partly so that then they can hang out and enjoy the comradeship of their fellow workers, and the alcohol is sort of a social lubricant that everyone expects to see there. So that was not an unusual thing. Everybody drinks on the job. That's just the way it was, and that was true for all those pre-modern economic days in the old barter system and the old-fashioned kind of workplaces. Well, as the Second Great Awakening began to inspire some people in New England, some of those employers decided that they were going to change the circumstances of the workplace, and they began to remove the alcohol from the workplace. There are all sorts of objections, of course, because the workers that they're hiring, who have many other issues with the way things are changing in their status, the bastardization of craft is going on, their wages are being reduced, and so forth. This is the time we have the early labor unions and some of the other unrest between the social classes. One of the things that the workers are objecting to is, hey, we want to still be able to drink on the job. And you'll see that as one of the conditions that early workers' unions or working men's parties are talking about as they're objecting to their change in status during this period. Um, what happened, though, is that as the most religious bosses took alcohol out of the workplace, which they did for their own religious reasons, they were surprised to find that after some initial reluctance and after some time of adjustment, after that was over, then the employees, it turns out, in the alcohol free workplace, they're actually more efficient and they do a better job in producing the goods and services that their bosses have hired them to do. Today, I think that seems pretty obvious, but this was a surprise to people who lived through it because they thought that alcohol was sort of part of the job. And it turns out that people who aren't half buzzed the whole afternoon are going to be able to keep doing the work all throughout the day, as opposed to maybe just be productive in the morning and then be able to sleepy in the afternoon. This was a surprise. And given that the market revolution is really all about competition, and is predicated especially on trying to figure out a way to make your goods or service less expensive and more efficiently than your competitors who aren't necessarily your neighbors but could be people doing business, 2 states away or up the river or whatever. As the religiously inspired temperance reform movement inspired bosses take the booze out of the workplace and their workers become more efficient, then eventually Employers who didn't really care about the temperance movement began to remove the alcohol from their workplace as well because they had to keep up with their competitors whose employees were now more efficient. So that's all happening at the same time as all these other economic changes are going on. And as I said, the employees don't like it, but it does lead to a significant change in the way work takes place and also a significant change in what the workplace itself is like. And some of the most religiously inspired employers tried to make sure that they only hired men who had signed this pledge not to drink. And there's even going to be some who will follow or hire people to follow their employees home afterwards to make sure that they're not drinking outside of the workplace. As late as the early 20th century, Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company routinely hired industrial spies who are tracking down the drinking habits of his employees, and he would just fire people if it turns out that they drank. Um, which is telling us that the working class people have not stopped drinking. Where previously, in the sort of pre modern barter system days of the small workplaces, that was really the old fashioned way of doing things, those workers drank together at work and shared the comradeship of a couple of drinks during the day as they worked. They didn't stop sharing that comradeship and they didn't stop drinking together. They just didn't do it during the day when they're on the clock. Instead, what happens is that men who work together and want to sort of hang out together and enjoy each other's company, um, they continue to drink socially. They just did it elsewhere. And so as the liquor began to be removed from the workplace, workers began to drink more commonly after work, still and often the same groups of men, but they would sort of go home and on their way home stop for a couple of drinks and stand around the bar and talk about how hard their day was and maybe someone would treat everybody to a drink or whatever. And this is a key part of working class, especially masculine culture, that the temperance movement really couldn't get at because social drinking was still very deeply ingrained in working class culture. They just did it elsewhere now. So the temperance movement is going to have to try to figure out a way to solve that, or at least get at the working class drinkers who are doing a lot of the drinking in the country. Their problem is they're not speaking the language of those workers. So far, the temperance leaders have been ministers and they've been employers, they've been elites who really are on a different plane socially and therefore are going to have a tough time getting on the level of and communicating effectively with the working class people who are the drinkers that the temperance movement is going to need to do something about if they're going to be successful. So, how is that going to happen? Well, it's going to happen by the working class itself, by workers themselves developing some sort of temperance movement of their own. And that did happen. There were working class oriented reform movement temperance groups that began to grow at the same time that this temperance movement is happening in the churches. The most important of these is a group called the Washingtonians. They were formed in 1840 in Baltimore, so just up the road from us. Baltimore, for at least a century, had the reputation as the wettest city in the country. More drinking per capita happening there than anywhere else in the country, so be proud of that. Um, so, Baltimore, there was a temperance meeting that was happening on this particular day in the city, and that's happening at a church. Around the corner from that church, because Baltimore had bars on every corner, around the corner from that church, there's a bar, and there's a bunch of guys who are all drinking there. And eventually, half a dozen of them got the idea that they're going to go to the temperance meeting and just heckle. Their plan is just to sort of disturb the meeting, just be jerks. And they think this will be fun because they've had a few drinks and they think it'll be fun to sort of go, make fun of the snobs and the blue noses. So those half dozen guys left, and the rest of their buddies stayed behind the bar. And the half dozen guys who went to the meeting came back a couple of hours later, and their friends, who by this point are very drunk, their friends said, "So how was it? What happened? Did you throw things? Did you yell? Did you make anybody cry?" That's what they're wondering. And the half dozen guys who went to the meeting said, no, 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 we didn't do any of that. We heard what the minister had to say, and we realized that he was right. And we do drink too much, and that we do have to change our ways. And we were so inspired by his message that when he asked people to come forth to sign the pledge that they're not going to drink again, we all went and signed. And in fact, we think you guys should too. And at that moment, these half dozen members of this community are talking on level with their friends and neighbors, with their coworkers. And in that bar on that day, uh, a group was created that eventually calls themselves the Washingtonians. They name themselves that because they want to sound very patriotic. The irony is that George Washington drank a lot, as most Americans do, because I've already said. But it sounded patriotic, and eventually they were successful enough. They had a female offshoot, an auxiliary called the Martha Washingtonians for their wives and sisters and daughters. And within 3 years, the Washingtonians, which started in this one small group in Baltimore, spread all over the country, especially New England and New York and New Jersey. And they had maybe as many as 600,000 members in the local Washingtonian clubs that sprang up all over the country. The Washingtonian success was largely because they figured out a way to make the idea of not drinking something that would be fun. Whereas the temperance meetings were pretty boring, sermons and speeches and lecturing and people wagging their fingers, and where's the fun in that? The Washingtonians, their meetings were fun. They had a great time. They sang songs. They would sometimes sponsor picnics or other events to try to encourage people to find ways to enjoy themselves that didn't involve drinking. The meetings were very inspirational. People would stand up and they would talk about how they changed their lives. Everyone would clap for those people. And the really the success of the Washingtonians was because the leaders came from within the working class, and they were able to talk a language that other working class people were able to listen to. Now, the Washingtonians eventually faded away. By the early 1850s, there aren't that many of them left anymore. They had their moment and then they sort of faded away. I've always assumed that part of the problem was they ran out of stuff to talk about. Because if really the meeting is, well, I didn't drink this week and you didn't drink this week, well, let's go home. But the other problem is that they were so successful, they're kind of victims of their own success because a lot of the Washingtonian clubs got taken over by temperance leaders who came out of the churches and these other elite groups, and then the meetings got a lot less fun and a lot less oriented toward the working class. The other reason why the Washingtonians were so successful is not just because of the Second Great Awakening and not just because of the temperance movement, but because this is a time when people join clubs. This is a time when people join organizations and social organizations. Alexis de Tocqueville, who I opened up the lecture with, had another chapter in which he talked about how America is a nation of joiners. He was convinced that there was something in the democratic spirit that made Americans join not just political parties, which they're going to do to help make the decisions for the country, but all kinds of other organizations. And indeed, the 19th century, Americans joined just every kind of thing, whether it's labor unions or political parties. They're going to church, but they're also getting together with people with the same ethnic background or with similar work experience or just people in the neighborhood or whatever. We do a lot less of this now. But throughout most of the 19th century and deep into the 20th century, men especially, but women also, would regularly join lots of different community groups. These days, we have found other outlets for our entertainment, and so having to join a club to find people that you want to hang out with is less likely. But also the reason why those clubs were such a big deal is because they spoke to an important need in the community. Mostly these are clubs for men. And so we're talking about what are called fraternal organizations. The idea is that you join it and then you join sort of a band of brothers. Um, and there are all kinds of fraternal organizations of all sorts, some of which still exist today. The Masons, which is older than the time period I'm talking about, but continues to this day, does still exist. There are a few others that you might see around. You might drive by an American Legion post or a Veterans of Foreign War, VFW post. Those are small, but they do exist. And there are still a few others of these fraternal organizations that still exist in some towns, but not nearly to the extent that they used to as recently as probably the 1960s or 70s before television and cable TV and the internet came along and people just stopped going to those clubs. But the fraternal organizations of the 19th century didn't just serve the purpose of providing an outlet and giving people something to do. They also were important in the community because they gave people mutual support. In those days, there was no government sponsored pensions or unemployment insurance or any kind of social safety net. Didn't exist. You're pretty much on your own. If you lose your job, you got to go find a new job. If you get hurt in the job, then somehow you got to figure out a way to make ends meet until you feel better. Um, but if you join a fraternal organization, and you're a regular member of a fraternal organization where you and other men who are your brothers, you've sworn an oath to support, you have joined a group of people who will take care of each other. So if you are a regular member of a fraternal organization or of many different ones, then if something bad happens to you, then your brothers in that fraternal organization, they'll look out for you. They'll help you find a new job. They'll help you pay your bills until you can get a new job or until you recover from your illness or injury. In a terrible worst case scenario, but a common scenario given the kind of workplace environment of the 19th century, people die on the job or some other kind of an accident, then a member of a fraternal organization would get, their family would get some sort of a pension, at least funeral expenses paid for. Sometimes widows of members of the fraternal organization would find that the local chapter of whatever it was, the Odd Fellows or whatever, that they would bring food by on a regular basis or even money. So it's smart. It's a good defense thing to be a member of these organizations because you never know what's going to happen. Bad stuff can happen at any given time, especially for working class people who are living paycheck to paycheck. If something bad happens, but you're a member of one of these groups, then those people will pass the hat and help you out. And so the Washingtonians are just one example of that. They just happen to be a fraternal organization for people who don't drink. But a lot of the people in that organization would probably be members of two or three others because it's just good to be in groups like that to make sure that you have someone to look out for you. Okay, back to the drinking. So you combine the active efforts by the temperance movement in the churches, plus the changes that took place in the workplace, and then at least some working class oriented opposition to drinking through groups like the Washingtonians, and there was a dramatic impact on American drinking. Between 1830 and 1840, as the temperance movement is really taking off, our best guess is that American drinking got cut in half, which is a remarkable success for this Second Great Awakening inspired reform movement. And yet, as they got into the 1840s, the leaders of the temperance movement began to be convinced that they were failing. They began to be convinced that they had persuaded as many people as were persuadable, that they had been around at this point for a decade or more, and their ideas had been as promulgated as they possibly could get them, and they felt that they had addressed and help change the behavior of as many people who will listen to their message. But the people left behind who were still drinking, those people are so deeply rooted in their drinking culture that really no further words are going to help. And so the temperance movement, which originally was a movement intended to persuade, to inspire, coming out of the Second Great Awakening with its emphasis on reform, that movement began to shift gears and began to try to emphasize that maybe now our goal should be to stop people from drinking entirely through legal methods. So they began to try to get laws passed to make the sale and purchase of alcoholic beverages illegal. Their first success came at the very beginning of the 1850s. In 1851, in the state of Maine, that state legislature passed a law which banned the sale of alcoholic beverages, with very few exceptions, throughout the state. It's not surprising in some ways that Maine is where they had their first success. The Second Great Awakening was strongest up in New England. Therefore, the temperance movement was strongest up in New England, and Maine had the first of these laws. After Maine passed that law, then temperance reformers in other places wanted to have their own version of that. And these spin-off versions were always known in the time period as Maine laws. Maine passed its law, and so then temperance reformers in Vermont want to have a Maine law, and temperance reformers in Rhode Island want to have a Maine law, and temperance reformers in Maryland want to have a Maine law. They want to have a law like the one in Maine that made it illegal to buy or sell alcohol. And they have transitioned at this point. They're not temperance reformers anymore. They're not really saying we want to get people to drink less. They're trying to prohibit the sale of alcohol because they're convinced that drinking too much is just a sin. Getting a Maine law passed outside of Maine turned out to be a lot trickier. Maine, in many ways, was the ideal place for them to have this success because it is in New England, it is in the hotbed of the Second Great Awakening, but also it's a very homogeneous place. Most of the people in Maine are very similar in those days, and there isn't a lot of cultural difference, and therefore most people, once the idea got kicked around, most people agreed that it was necessary and that it was okay, and it passed in Maine in a way that was not as possible in the politics of other places where the culture was more divided and where there was likely to be opponents to the idea of a Maine law. So, as the 1850s wore on, many people believed that the most important issue and the most divisive issue, the front page story of the politics of the 1850s, looks like it's going to be an effort to get these Maine laws passed. So the temperance movement, as it shifts into being a prohibition movement, that seemed like it was the big political story of the 1850s, because these prohibitionists, as I'm going to call them from this point on, they're trying to get a Maine law passed in their state, and their state, and their state, and then they have to push against opponents. The way it works out politically, Whigs are more likely to support Maine laws than Democrats. Partly this is because of where the Whigs are stronger. The Whigs really are more a northern party. They're strong in New England, and the Second Great Awakening is strong in New England, and the temperance movement is strong in New England. So the Whigs tend to be more likely to support the Maine law for religious and moral reasons. But also, they're more likely to support something like this because the Whigs are, of the two parties, they're the one that is most likely to support the idea of the government getting involved in the economy, of the government doing things and playing an active role in people's lives. In contrast, the Democrats tended to oppose Maine laws. Um, the Democrats, the party of the South and the West, are in the regions where the Second Great Awakening is not as strong, where this religious fervor had not spread quite as much. And the Democrats are the party dating back to Jackson and his spiritual advisor, Thomas Jefferson. They believe that the government should not be that active. And on moral as well as economic reasons, they thought that the government should do very little, and they therefore did not, as a rule, did not support the passage of Maine laws. There are social and cultural differences also involved in the politics of the Maine laws. So people who live in rural areas are more likely to support the passage of a Maine law, whereas people in urban areas tend to oppose it. People in urban areas tend to be more cosmopolitan. Also, there are more bars and there is more social drinking going on in those urban places. And so city residents tend to oppose Maine laws and country residents tend to support them. Also, there is this sort of cultural difference. We're going to talk a little bit later in the semester next week about some of the immigrants who are arriving, but there's significant numbers of immigrants coming from places like Germany and Ireland who bring with them strong cultural predisposition to social drinking. And they're also Catholics and therefore opposed to anything pushed by a bunch of Protestants. Those immigrants strongly oppose any kind of attack on their drinking culture, and therefore they oppose the Maine laws, whereas more traditional WASPy type Protestants are more likely to support the Maine laws, and so there's this cultural divide. And so it turns out that there isn't really much in the way of passage of similar laws that takes place in the aftermath of the main law. Instead, this question of prohibition became one of the big cultural dividing issues that really lasts well past our semester. And prohibition and the temperance movement in general continue to be a big part of the culture. Eventually, had a crescendo in the early 20th century when prohibitionists were successful in getting an amendment to the Constitution that took the basic idea of the Maine Law and made it national law. A terrible failure. The prohibition of alcoholic beverages that was passed right after World War One, that was repealed in 1933 because in the meantime, a lot of people in the country drank. They just did it illegally, and it was a disaster. But at the time in the 1850s, nobody knows that that's eventually going to happen. Instead, this reform movement that came out of the Second Great Awakening was one of the biggest stories in the country and had a lot of success, even though they felt that they had failed, much as the Sabbatarians felt they had failed. From the point of view of hindsight, these guys are clearly much more successful than they gave themselves credit for. There was one other very, very important social reform movement that grew out of the Second Great Awakening, which is going to be focused on the question of slavery. This is going to be the abolitionist movement, and they are going to be the most consequential of these reform movements that I'll be talking about. Before I get to the actual abolitionists, though, I want to back up a little bit and try to get some context about what the discussion about slavery had been before we kind of build up to this specific movement that starts really in the 1830s. So there had been people who opposed slavery for moral reasons dating back to the 1700s. The Quakers, for example, because of their belief in equality and social equality, they had opposed slavery, and there were small Quaker groups opposed to slavery as early as the 1770s in places like Pennsylvania, but had limited effects, although they probably had some effect on some of the northern states that abolished slavery after the American Revolution, but they didn't really have an effect on the overall sense of slavery in the country. Uh, Although there were people like the Quakers who opposed slavery, and although there are other people who came out of the Revolution believing that slavery was bad for the country, in the early 1800s, as the South dug in more on slavery, for the reasons we talked about in my previous lecture, because of cotton, because of economic reasons, and because of all the racism that is inherent in any of the ideas about African Americans in those days. You put all that together, and the South really dug in, and the whole country more or less accepted that. But there were some people who were critics of the South for continuing to have slaves and for not continuing what had started at the time of the Revolution when the North had freed slaves. So people who are raising this objection to slavery really weren't particularly well organized and not ideologically very well organized because they hadn't really truly come up with or made their peace with some of the basic principles that are inherent in a real attack on slavery, certainly not any idea of equality of the races or anything like that. Instead, there's sort of a halfway step in that direction in the 18 teens and 20s. Some people who defended slavery said to those who objected to slavery that getting rid of slavery would be impossible because it would just be unfeasible. Because what's going to happen if we do free all the slaves? What'll happen to the slaves? And the racism of the time led most white people to imagine that if the slaves were freed, and remember, by 1800, there's 1 million slaves in the country. If suddenly 1 million people who used to be slaves yesterday are free today, the white people of the country imagined that all of those former slaves are going to roam the countryside, not knowing what to do for themselves, stealing things, causing all kinds of problems. And that tells you a lot about the racist ideas of the white folks of the day. But that was something that people who supported slavery said, therefore, we should keep the slaves as slaves. So people who are trying to figure out what to do to that objection began to propose an idea called colonization. And this led to a national movement created by the American Colonization Society in 1816, which was a very well known and supported by some very key figures in the country. The idea here is that the Colonization Society would raise money and it would use that money for the purchase of the freedom of individual slaves, maybe a handful at a time, however much they could afford. But rather than keep those former slaves in the country, where white people were scared that a former slave would not be able to handle freedom and would create all sorts of social problems. And again, the racism here should be very clear. The American Colonization Society would then take the former slaves whose freedom they had purchased and then pay to transport them to Africa with the idea that there they wouldn't be an American problem anymore. And in fact, former slaves from the United States could bring some American style civilization to the African tribes that they would then now be living amongst. The racism here should be very clear. The Colonization Society did raise money and ultimately paid for the freedom of thousands of slaves. It was formed in 1816 and continued to exist for at least a decade and a half after that, before it started to fade away in the 1830s. Um, the former slaves that they then colonized, in other words, set up a colony of former slaves in Africa, or eventually helped establish the country of Liberia. Liberia, you may know, its capital is Monrovia, named after President James Monroe, who was president when the American Colonization Society got off the ground and was a member. Monroe was a member. Henry Clay, Speaker of the House and most important guy in the country during the era of good feelings, was a member. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall was a member. All those guys were slave owners, it's worth pointing out, and in some way didn't see the hypocrisy of buying the freedom of some slaves and shipping them to Africa while also continuing to own their own slaves, which shows you some of the ways in which American Colonization Society, the ideas behind it are, they don't really add up. Um, there's all kinds of economic reasons why it's not clear that they had really thought this through. Certainly, given that the South's economy is predicated on slavery, it's not like they're really going to be able to raise enough money to purchase the freedom of all the slaves in the South and then pay to have them transported over to Liberia. That economically is unfeasible and never going to be solved because the price would just keep going up if they eventually started to buy up a bunch of the slaves. But there's also the moral question of, do the slaves actually want to go to Africa? No one in the American Colonization Society is actually asking them. Their assumption is that slaves would rather be in Africa than they would rather be here. But the reality is that the slaves want a third choice. They don't want to stay here as slaves, and they're not too excited, with some exceptions, about going to Africa, a place they don't know, where in some cases 3 or 4 generations they've been living here. They don't necessarily want to go there either, whether they're free or not. What the slaves really want is they want to be free, but be here in a place that they know. Again, no one's really asking them. Um, but that became a little bit more obvious because it's an element in an important book that was published around the time the Colonization Society was at its peak. This book was written by a former slave, an escaped slave, a man named David Walker. Walker had escaped to the north, was living in Boston. Boston is, in some ways, the best place to be a free person of color because there's a significant population there of free people of color that he can be part of that community. And he can actually get work. And although it's not great to be a black person anywhere in the country because of all the discrimination against them, Boston life could be a little bit better. And so that was a good place for him, relatively. Um, David Walker wound up writing a book that was published in 1829. It's got a very long title, but it's generally referred to just as Walker's Appeal. And who he's appealing to is the slaves, of whom he had previously been. He is hoping that if the slaves hear what he has to say, that they will be convinced by his appeal to rise up against their oppressors. He is appealing to the colored races, as he called them, to rise up against the slave owners to destroy slavery by violence. And that is the central message of the book. Scared the hell out of any white person who read it, north or south. Southerners, of course, are frightened to death of the message of Walker's appeal, worried that their slaves will find out about it and will be inspired to things like Nat Turner's revolt. Frightened to death of that. It's not super likely because they have made it their business to make sure that the slaves cannot read such a book because they're not allowed to be educated with even the basic reading and writing. And then also, Southerners made sure that it was illegal for the purchase of that book or for anyone to even have it anywhere in the South. And they helped make it illegal to even ship it through the mail. Walker's appeal, in the end, he was only able to have a press run of a few hundred copies, and most of those copies were then destroyed by white people who found the book and considered it to be dangerous. Northerners, too. Northerners considered David Walker, for the most part, they considered his ideas to be radical and dangerous. He's calling for a race riot, a nationwide race riot, a race revolt that would lead to racial violence all throughout the country, and they are convinced that what he is calling for is just way too dangerous. And a year after the book came out, Walker was found dead on the streets, poisoned, not to this day known by whom, but one can imagine probably at least what the person looked like who was responsible for his poisoning, because he was, at the time, the most dangerous man in the country. All right, well, Walker's appeal had a section about colonization. And in the chapter about colonization, remember, he is trying to talk to the slaves. They are his audience, even though it's not clear that any slave ever read the book, almost certainly not, or heard about the book, probably not that many. But his goal is to send this message to the slaves. And in his chapter on colonization, Walker told the slaves that the white people are trying something called colonization. And what they're doing is they're trying to get rid of us. Well, we shouldn't fall for it. This is yet another white conspiracy, just a white hoax. Because just as things are starting to get a little uncomfortable, just as white people are starting to realize that maybe we're more powerful than they're comfortable with, they're trying to get rid of us. Just at the time when all of the success and all of the wealth that we have created for them, they don't want to share that with us. Well, rather than accepting the idea of being shipped off to Africa to a place that we don't know anymore, instead we should stay here because our fate is here. This is our home, and the wealth of the South we have created, and therefore this colonization idea, forget it. We're not going for it. Now, I don't really believe that too many people read the book, but they certainly knew of it. But his ideas and his attack on colonization go a little bit of a way toward making the concept behind colonization not so successful. But the real thing that happened that made colonization really disappear as a viable option was the rise of a truly anti-slavery movement that in this case came out of the Second Great Awakening. There is an abolitionist movement that grew out of religious groups and really took off in the 1830s. Their goal is to abolish slavery, to get rid of slavery. And they are inspired by the same moral fervor and the same sense of Christian purpose and the same belief that the country could be reformed that these other reform movements, the temperance movement, the Sabbatarians, and everybody else, the abolitionists are inspired by their religion and their religious beliefs because they believe that Christianity and slavery are incompatible and that no human should own any other human. And the abolitionists will even be crazy enough to say that black people and white people are equal in the eyes of God, which was a radical thing to say. Black people, of course, knew that. But for a white person to say that is a radical statement. And one of the reasons why the abolitionists never get that big is because that they are radicals for their time. The first really big name in the abolitionist movement is a journalist who's based out of Boston. Boston, as I said, was a good place for this sort of thing. A white guy named William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison moved to Boston in 1831. He previously lived in Baltimore, where his anti-slavery ideas were not nearly as popular. So he moved to Boston in 1831 and began publishing an anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator. The idea of The Liberator is that it is going to attack slavery. Uh, the Latin root, same Latin root that Liberia gets its name from, means freedom. So, in a weekly newspaper that he published and ultimately published every week from its inception in 1831 until slavery was abolished in 1865, he didn't know it was going to take nearly that long. Garrison hammered away at slavery, explaining to his readers that slavery was evil, that it was inconsistent with Christianity, it was inconsistent with the best principles of the country, and that therefore it should be immediately abolished. And he took this very basic, simple moral tone and then talked about the news of the day through the lens of that basic belief, because slavery is evil and it must be immediately abolished. And anything that was happening that in any way went against that, he would attack those people in the pages of his newspaper by saying these people are not helping end this horrible evil. Garrison was taking a pretty radical stand about slavery. Some people said that that really wasn't possible for slavery to go away immediately. You can't snap your fingers and make an institution go away where there's a million people who are owned by others and there's incredible the price of them or the value of them or whatever. Um, so some people said to Garrison, well, a more practical way to talk about the slavery problem. Yeah, maybe slavery should go away, but to make it easier to make it go away, we should figure out a way to compensate the slave owners, because if they have to give up their slaves, they're going to have lost a lot of value, and we need to figure out a way that they'd be willing to accept that. Garrison said to people like that, no, 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 you don't understand. Slavery is wrong. It's morally wrong. It's evil. And you don't compensate somebody for their evil. You don't pay someone and reward them because they did a bad thing. Instead, you punish them for that. So Garrison said there's no way that we as a country should be compensating the slave owners if they give up their slaves. They just need to do it because it's the right thing to do. You don't pay somebody because they sin a little bit less this week than they did last week. You don't pay somebody, well, I killed 5 people this week and I'm only going to kill 3 people next week. You don't pay somebody a reward for being a nicer guy. You don't pay somebody for lying less. You don't pay somebody for stealing less. If you're a thief or a liar or a crook or a killer, you're a bad person. And you just have to stop doing that. And rewarding someone for that behavior makes you culpable for their crimes. Other people said, all right, well, forget that idea, but clearly the only real rational way to get rid of slavery would be some sort of gradual emancipation. Some northern states, that is how they got rid of their slaves, um, especially the sort of mid-Atlantic northern states. So New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, as they abolished slavery, they generally did it in a sort of slow, uh, general way, where in fact New Jersey still had some slaves in the state, even though officially it was not a slave state. As late as the Civil War, there's still a few slaves in New Jersey because of how gradual they emancipated people. But Garrison isn't having that either. Again, slavery in his mind is a sin. Slavery is evil. And you don't slowly stop sinning. You just either you're a sinner or you're not a sinner. And there's no way you can sort of wean yourself off being a bad person. All along the way, you'll still be a bad person until you stop doing it. So Garrison said, right now, today, right this second, the only real thing that we can do that will be morally justifiable is to end slavery right now. And he was hoping for changing the minds, changing the heart, changing the souls of the country by spreading this abolitionist idea, this immediate sense that for moral reasons, slavery, which is an evil of the country, needed to go away. They didn't know it was going to take a whole generation for and big changes to come, but he hammered away at that theme. And you'll remember that 1831 is the year of the Nat Turner Revolt. Southerners' worst fears realized that the slaves are fighting against them and killing some of them. They blamed William Lloyd Garrison and his abolitionist newspaper, which Nat Turner had never heard of, but they believed that he had helped stir up this revolutionary sentiment and tried to get them killed. And Garrison said, I had nothing to do with it. but this is why you need to get rid of slavery. The slaves know slavery is wrong, and they're going to keep fighting. And so, unless you get rid of slavery right now, things like this are going to keep happening. Um, Garrison is spreading what is a very, very moral based and intolerant response to the slave owners. He's not in any way buying what they're selling. As his newspaper began to spread, and most of his original subscribers were black people, free people of color in New England, and eventually other white folks who, like him, were inspired by the Second Great Awakening and believed that slavery was a sin, he also began to travel around and speak before audiences to try to spread his attack on slavery. He then helped organize the first truly national organization against slavery, founded in 1833. It's called the American Anti-Slavery Society, although I guess calling it truly national really doesn't tell the truth because it's not organized in the South. There are no local chapters of the American Anti-Slavery Society south of the Mason-Dixon line. There's none in Maryland, there's none in Virginia, or the Carolinas, or all the way into the Deep South. Um, there are some abolitionists in the South, but they leave. Because if you're inspired by the abolitionist ideas and you believe that slavery is wrong, everyone else in the white South disagrees with you so strongly, they want to beat you up. So people who change their minds about slavery, they get out of the South and they go to the North where they can then tell everyone else, I changed my mind and maybe other people can too. But most people in the South think the abolitionists are crazy. Um, Garrison was not a compromiser. Garrison believed that anything that would not lead to the immediate end of slavery was part of the problem. He attacked people in the North as much as he attacked people in the South. Anyone who wasn't helping end slavery, in his newspaper, he attacked them. And Garrison came to believe that politics, which is inherently about compromise, was something that anyone in abolitionism should not get involved in because he felt that that would water down the moral purity of the movement. To try to get laws passed or to try to get any kind of policy change would inevitably be just sort of a halfway measure. And he's not about halfway measures, he's about immediate results. Garrison told his supporters, you shouldn't vote, you shouldn't get involved in the political system because that's inherently about compromise, and we are not about compromise. We are right, and we're going to push this issue until the country changes. Garrison eventually came to believe that not only was voting and politics inherently corrupt and not going to help the movement, he turned against the very Constitution, the central governing body of the country. It was clear to him that the Constitution accepted slavery. The Three-Fifths Clause and various other parts of the Constitution clearly show that the founders of the country had accepted or had sort of made a deal to accept slavery. And to him, that meant that the Constitution was morally wrong and was part of the problem. And in a meeting of the American Anti Slavery Society, Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution, a radical act showing the righteousness of his belief, but also showing just how very different his way of looking at the country is than the vast majority of the people, North or South. Right, so obviously Garrison can't travel to the South. Obviously, no white person in the South is really going to listen to what he has to say. But it's worth pointing out that even though the abolitionist idea spread, certainly among the black community in the South, and to a small extent among the most religious Second Great Awakening inspired white people in the South, it really didn't grow as quickly as we might wish it did from the point of view of the 21st century. So if your version of the story is, well, when you get to the Civil War, the South's the bad guys because they had slavery, and the North are the good guys because they didn't have slavery. The reality is that when people like Garrison begin to tell people in the North that slavery is bad and they should, join the abolitionist cause, most white people in the North hated what the abolitionists had to say. They consider the abolitionists dangerous. They consider the abolitionists to be radicals. And when Garrison and some of the other abolitionists would speak publicly, they were in danger of their lives because there were riots where people would attack them, people would throw things at them. Garrison had to escape from a few public events in places like Philadelphia and New York, escape on the run for his life because there are people chasing after him who hate the things that he has to say and they wanted to kill him. And other abolitionists had similar problems. There were abolitionist newspapers that were just shut down or destroyed in other parts of the North. And there's another abolitionist journalist, a guy named Elijah Lovejoy, who tried to start a newspaper similar to the Liberator in Illinois, and his neighbors murdered him because they didn't want to listen to a guy in their community attacking slavery, which I'll point out, Illinois didn't have slavery. So the abolitionists had a tough time getting white Northerners to support their ideas. The question is why? If you believe that the story is supposed to be that the guys in the North, the folks in the North, were the good guys because they didn't have slavery, it's not nearly as neat and cut and dried as that. Most white people in the North oppose the abolitionists, partly for economic reasons. There are a lot of people who were doing business with the South, and therefore keeping things the way they were was good for business. There are people who are selling things to the South or buying things from the South, and anything that might change that economic situation is going to hurt business, whether you're the business person or whether you're an employee of a company that's doing business with the South. Like, for example, those textile companies who are making clothes out of shoddy merchandise that they're then selling to the slave owners. They want the South to keep going. Anyone who buys cotton wants the South to continue the way it is. And then many employees, many working class people, really despised the abolitionists because they feared what might happen if the abolitionists got their way. Because they're seeing these economic changes. They're happening around them. The market revolution is underway, the bastardization of craft, and these other changes in the workplace are happening. And the working class, this growing working class, is recognizing that their status is being diminished, their pay is going down, their lives in many ways are being minimized by these economic changes that are being created by all this new forms of competition. Well, the working class people were frightened to death that if the abolitionists got what they wanted, which is that 1,000,000 slaves are suddenly going to be free, working class people were convinced that those slaves would come to the North and be hired by their bosses, and then they'd be out of a job. Because the slaves are used to working for nothing, their employers are always looking for a way to get cheaper labor. They offer the jobs to former slaves for next to nothing. It's more than the slaves are used to getting. They'll take the job. And then the white workers are either out of a job or the only way they can keep a job is to accept wages that were practically slave labor. That's what they imagine happening. And they're terrified that the abolitionists, if they get their way, are going to continue the process of destroying the lives of the working class. And honestly, given what we know about capitalism and about the way the employers try to lower their labor costs, that's not an insane belief. Although another way to approach that would be for the white working class to try to work together with African Americans, to work together against the employers in some way where they could have solidarity. But that wasn't what most of the working class was thinking. And so in these riots, when people are rushing the stage or attacking the abolitionists or chasing them down and trying to kill them, most of the people engaged in that riotous behavior, most of the people who were that fervently opposed to the abolitionists, they're these working class people who are terrified about what might happen to them if the anti-slavery abolitionists had their way. And the truth is that most people in the North, they don't listen to what the abolitionists have to say because what the abolitionists are talking about doesn't make any sense to them. They've been told all their lives that white people are better than black people. They've never actually probably even met a black person because there are a lot of communities in the North where there's just all white folks. And so they have never seen anybody and encountered anybody to make them disbelieve the racism that is very, very much a part of American culture. At least people in the South have met a black person, even though they're mostly slaves, and so that's not going to change their opinion about the black people, but at least they've met them. White people, they have no conception at all in the North about what a slave looks like or how they act or the humanity, the basic humanity of people who just happened to be of African descent. And so the racist ideas that are very deeply a part of white culture, um, that is going to make a lot of people in the North just object to the idea of the abolitionists pushing for freedom of people who, in the minds of white people in the North, don't really deserve it or wouldn't be able to use it the right way or whatever. Education is going to have to happen for more people in the North to believe in anything closer to racial equality, and that doesn't happen at the snap of a finger. So, the abolitionists had a tough time selling their ideas. Garrison was convinced that he was right. And of course, he is right. Slavery is wrong. Slavery needed to end. But getting people to listen to him and getting people to believe what he was selling was very difficult in the North. And eventually, the abolitionist movement itself began to split when it became clear that Garrison wasn't going to be able to just magically make everyone in the country change their minds about slavery. Um, so in the 1840s, some people stuck with Garrison. Some people stuck with the strong moral tone that he had been espousing. But other people who opposed slavery decided that the only real way they were going to get anywhere on attacking slavery was to get into politics. So, more moderate abolitionists who tried to take over the American Anti Slavery Society and failed, in 1840 they decided that they would set up their own anti slavery political party. So, this is something that Garrison opposed, of course. He doesn't believe in politics, thought this was a terrible idea. The abolitionist movement is sort of splitting based on how radical they are, but also on their tactics. The party that was created with a similar name to Garrison's newspaper is called the Liberty Party. And the Liberty Party in 1840 organized, and they're only in the North, of course, they organized a campaign for president where their candidate opposed slavery and, if elected, promised that he would do everything in his power to stop the spread of slavery into new parts of the country and to begin to turn the country away from support of slavery. The Liberty Party, their candidate in 1840, got 7,000 votes, which is not that good. I'm pretty sure that if I ran for president, that I might get 7,000 votes. Former students of mine would never vote for me, but just someone might see my name on the ballot and say, "Oh, an Italian guy. I'm Italian. I'll vote for him." Elmo is likely to get 50,000 write-in votes in any presidential election. When I was a kid, Mickey Mouse used to get 50,000 votes every presidential election, and they're not even real people. Um, and so, for a candidate for an anti-slavery party, a real person in 1840, to only be able to muster about 7,000 votes, yeah, the country was smaller back then, but that's pretty bad. That's pretty weak tea, which show that the Liberty Party has a long way to go before they're going to get people to take their ideas seriously. Part of the problem was people who heard what the Liberty Party stood for said, well, you guys seem to care more about the slaves than you care about people who aren't slaves. And yeah, the Liberty Party wanted slavery to end. Their focus was telling everyone how awful slavery was, which didn't matter that much to most of the white people of the North. It's just too abstract for them. It's not part of their lives. It's not something that they're going to change their votes. And most people at that point, they're Democrats, they're Whigs. To choose this other third party about this one very narrow issue, most people are not going to go for that. And the Liberty Party was an experiment that really failed and didn't last very long because they just couldn't get the votes. But it's the beginning of an anti slavery political idea. A lot of the people who'd been in the Liberty Party later in the 1840s helped organize the Free Soil Party, which Martin Van Buren ran for president as their candidate in 1848. The Free Soil Party was not quite as focused on stopping slavery where it existed because they thought constitutionally there wasn't much they could do about it anyway. Instead, their longer term goal was to try to stop slavery from going into new territories, hence the name Free Soil, because they want to keep that land as free. And they thought that if they could keep slavery confined to the one part of the country it was in now, and if the country expanded beyond that and mostly the rest of the country didn't have slavery, they thought eventually slavery would die out. The Free Soil Party had a lot more success than the Liberty Party. They ran their candidate, Martin Van Buren, in 1848. He didn't win the election, but he did turn the tide against the Democrats in that key election that I mentioned previously from the Van Buren point of view. Uh, Part of the reason for their success is that they have moderated their point of view, but also part of the reason for their success is that they are beginning to talk about slavery and trying to figure out ways to get white people in the North to care about it from them, from their point of view. It's too abstract to tell a white person in the North, given all their racist ideas and all the economic ties to the South, that you should vote for a candidate who opposes slavery because slavery is bad for the slaves. Instead, you got to figure out a way to tell white people in the North that slavery is bad for them. And the Free Soil Party, this new political wing of the abolitionist idea, the Free Soil Party began to enunciate a couple of ideas opposed to slavery that became very powerful as the 1850s continued, and eventually later on the Republicans, when they got created, will pick up on. So, two last things. Two of the ideas opposed to slavery that are Free Soil Party ideas that then later politicians picked up on. One is an idea called free labor. There's a free labor ideology that's a central part of the political wing of abolitionism, late 1840s and through the 1850s. The idea here is that these politicians, these anti slavery politicians, looked at the country and they said, the country is becoming divided between two forms of work. In the South, they have slave labor. In the South, that means that the workers, they have to work, they're forced to work, they have no incentive to work, they don't want to work, they don't want to earn money and wealth for their owners, and so therefore the South's economy is stagnating and it's falling behind everybody else. The North, on the other hand, has free labor, and that means workers who can choose who they work for, who can quit a job that they don't like, who can go work for themselves if they can find opportunities. And because free labor is more inspirational and free labor is more about what people want to do and choose to do, the North's economy is stronger because it's predicated on free labor, predicated on this ability for people to kind of make up their own mind about what they want to do. It's more efficient, it's going to work better. The North's economy is stronger than the South because it's got free labor. And in this way, they're sucking up to the Northern workers and telling them, yeah, we're on your side, we understand your problems. But the anti slavery politicians of the Free Soil Party tell their listeners the country can't continue with both. We can't have slave labor in one part of the country and free labor in another part of the country. It's not going to work. Eventually, the country is going to have to choose. Slave labor, the slave owners down there are not easily going to give up. They're going to try to spread their thing into our part of the country, and we can't let that happen because we know that free labor is a better way for the country to go. And so it's not just good for us to hold on to free labor. We need to stop slave labor from spreading because eventually that's going to get into the North and it's going to affect the way that we know is the right way to live. And ultimately, the Republican Party, which is founded in the 1850s and continues to exist to today, that party, one of the basic principles that it's still based on is this emphasis on individual freedoms and individual rights in the workplace, which go back to this free labor ideology. Now, the other thing that the anti slavery politicians of the 1840s and 50s talked about as a way to get white Northerners to care about slavery was a conspiracy theory, which is smart politics because Americans love their conspiracy theories. This conspiracy theory is called the slave power conspiracy. And the way this works is these anti slavery Northerners look at the South and they say, look what happened in the South. A handful of really wealthy slave owners, big plantation owners, basically took over the whole South. They've got most of the land, they've got most of the wealth, they've got most of the political power, they're all the leaders, and there really aren't that many of them. And everybody else works for them. All the slaves work for them, but all the poor white people also support the slave owners. Those people are the slave power. They have taken over the South, the entire South, to work for them. with slavery as the thing that makes their wealth happen. Well, people who have power are greedy, and they're not going to stop there. The slave power, those powerful slave owners in the South, they're going to want to try to take over the whole country. They're going to want to try to get into the North. They're going to try to take over the federal government. They're going to try to take over the whole country and get everybody working for them, not just in the South, but all over the country. And therefore, we in the North have to stop that from happening. And the only way we can do that is if we crush that slave power before it grows too big. Now, that may sound paranoid, and indeed it is, uh, but keep a thought about that because it doesn't sound as crazy as we get to some of the political events of the 1850s, where slavery becomes more of a national issue, and some Northerners are going to start to believe that this slave power is indeed trying to take over the country and therefore hurt their own lives and take away their rights as free laborers. That's something we're going to come back to. So we'll pick up this story in the next lecture. Return to politics. If you've been missing political events and elections and presidents, congratulations. We have moved past now most of the social history stuff for the semester, and we'll get back to things that have a lot of dates. That's coming next. Thank you for the first part of today's lecture. After you take a break, come back for part two, a much shorter lecture, which will also be about social issues, specifically about gender. Thanks, and I will see you then.